trades trainees. She retired in 2004 as a senior power dispatcher, which is the highest electrical classification at the utility that's unionized. So she had a 30-year career at City Light. She's a lifelong feminist and human rights activist with Radical Women and Freedom Socialist Party, and an author of a Radical Women publication called Women Workers, Spark Plugs of Labor, and also Viva La Raza, A History of Chicano Identity and Resistance, published by Red Letter Press.
Yeah, it's, oh, and I want to make sure everyone knows we have lots of historical material to share with anyone who wants to share it. We'd be interested in making that happen. You know, it's hard to convey the excitement and the dynamism of that period. Some of the beginning slides give you an idea. Things were just popping in the areas of racial equality, women's rights, and social justice generally. And City Light was right in the middle of that. To give you a little background, in 1972, I had represented Radical Women in support work for the United Construction Workers Association, which was the group that was fighting for primarily men, but people of color in the construction trades. And they did a lot of demonstrations, civil disobedience, some overturning of heavy equipment, and various things to win hiring for men of color in Seattle. It was a huge battle. And I was arrested in a mass civil disobedience trespass onto the construction site that was then in place at Seattle Central Community College. I don't remember how many people were arrested. And one of the things that Radical Women had done was we had gone to UCWA and said, we're supporting you, and we'd like you to make a statement in support of the hiring of women into the construction trades, which they did. And little did I know that a couple of years later I would be one of the beneficiaries of that. And then, as Ellie said, 2 months before we were hired, there's this enormous City Light walkout where virtually everyone but top management walked out of City Light. That included the electrical workers, the engineers, and a lot of administrative workers who were, of course, mostly women. And one of the really significant parts of that is that Clara Fraser was one of the key people who got especially the women building workers to come out in support. And she and the people that she worked with, one of the things they said was, you know, to Local 77, the electrical workers, yes, we'll come out and support you, and then we want you to organize us, because they were unorganized. The engineers had their union, but they were not in a union. And IBEW agreed to do that, or walkout members of the union agreed. I'm not sure where that lay, but there was a pledge made. And Clara, because of those activities, was one of the leaders of the walkout. She was a kind of a spokesperson for the building workers. So this is, of course, important because Gordon Vickery went into the red zone about that and never forgave her and didn't have great eyes on the electrical trades trainee program because of it. And Ellie mentioned how the program was crafted to be successful, but I want to emphasize that because that's very important. Not only was the men's of color program at City Light not designed to be successful, most affirmative action programs were not. They had a tendency to hire 1 or 2 people at a time, and then they'd be run off the job before the next people were hired. And that's why the hiring of 10 women was really important. The group was racially diverse. There were 2 black women, a Chicana, and an Asian American woman. There were 5 at least of us were active feminists in the feminist movement, and I think that was an important factor. 3 women were lesbians, and it was in all ways a diverse group, and that was important too. And one of the other things that was in the crafting of the program was that we would join the union immediately, which had not been true for the men ETTs, and made all the difference. Because sometimes the union was more supportive than others, but the fact that we were members gave us standing. Very key. And then to talk about, I wanted to focus more on our experiences, you know, what it was like in the trenches. Well, in our first week, while we had still not gone out into the field, the majority of the trainees went to a mass meeting of the employee group and made a statement of support for the walkout group. That was really essential. You know, we all, well, except for Pat Eng at that time, and possibly a couple of the other women who were, I say were lesbian separatists. Apparently not all of them define themselves as such today, but anyway, most of the women just instinctively supported the workers, but also it was very important to our survival to say we're on your side and we're coming out the cruise soon. So it was the wise thing to do as well. But this infuriated Vickery, and I have no doubt that that had a lot to do with the fact that our training program was canceled halfway through the 2 weeks of the full-time training, and we were forced out onto the cruise early without even having gotten a paycheck with which to buy work clothes and things. That was part of the timeline that was messed up. And as Ellie said, it did make a difference that several of us were radicals, were socialists and feminists, and strong supporters of unionism in general. Because when we were fighting for our job, we knew to reach out to the labor movement, and we got support from the labor movement, which then really built our support in the community as a whole. One of my first experiences was on one of the first days when I was walking into South Line to go to work. 2 white guys accosted me before I even got through the gate to ask me if what they had heard was true, that I was a radical woman. And I had to sort of stammer, well, yes, I am. And later, we all cracked up because they were much more cranked off about the fact that I was a feminist than that I was a socialist and a radical. Also I want to mention that from the beginning, the black men, other men of color too, but primarily it was black men, were our closest supporters and helped us out. I remember I got rides to work in the first period from a coworker who lived on my block. It was wonderful, and some of the longest time employees were the helpers, the black helpers, who you know, couldn't break into the journey level ranks, but they knew the ropes around City Light, and they were very helpful to us, and we returned the favor by supporting them. And we certainly had initially dispiriting relations with the union some of the time. Our first union meeting was the one where the business rep reported that he had called a meeting of building workers to see how much interest there was in the union. He didn't mention he'd called it on a couple hours' notice, and the organizers, Clara and Marilyn and some of the other people, just weren't able to scrape up very many people on such short notice. He didn't mention that part, but he said, you know, very few people showed up, so there's no interest, so I'd like a vote of the membership that we give up the organizing drive. And all these guys are going, yeah. So, and we didn't have that much to say. We hadn't even been inducted yet. So, and Ellie mentioned how the letter that we got saying, you know, I pledge that I will agree with every management action, or I'm not interested in working for City Light. So we call that the loyalty oath. And we did get around it by consulting lawyers and signing a thing saying we're not legally allowed to give up our civil rights, but we want to work for City Light. So, and the letter we got saying, at the end of our year, saying, congratulations for completing the program. We called that the congratulations, you're fired letter, because it was very clear that they were going to just escort us out the door. And the times were unusual in that it only took us a year to go through that hearing process, get the investigation done, go through the hearing process, and win our case. At that time, 90% of discrimination cases were upheld. And then as the rules got gradually changed over time, now it's 90% the other way. 90% of them fail. So we were lucky about the times that we were living in. And the settlement, as Ellie said, required City Light to offer us apprentice positions. But City Light was able to say, well, you know, we're just not going to have a constructor apprenticeship, which doesn't require climbing poles this year. Unlike every other year, we just have the line apprenticeship. So 3 of us took that deal, and 3 of us said, no, don't think that's going to work. And they kept working as helpers, and over time, you know, took civil service exams and were hired as journey level people. Some sooner and some after a number of years. But
Megan, may I ask?
Sure.
Before I forget, why climbing poles was such a big deal, and why was that seen as an impediment to
okay,
pregnancy?
it's just harder. It's more dangerous. The line work itself is much heavier work, takes more upper body strength, and because you're standing on a pole, you have to do all the work with just your arms and your upper body. Thank you for asking that.
And one other thing about the pole training, at this time, there wasn't a formal training process for the men coming in the apprenticeship for pole climbing either, and it was a way of hazing people and getting rid of people that the existing employees didn't like. It's a very difficult task, and the tradition was over generations that when a line worker got hurt, and then the helper that day would start becoming a line worker. And usually it was kind of this fathers and uncles and brothers thing of training people on pole work. In the case of the women, and in the case of white men too that came in that weren't prepared, it was a way of getting rid of them. And it was a fairly probable that people would get hurt doing it if they didn't have enough training. So that was, and after being helpers, I'm sure that the women, the ETTs, knew what they were looking at in terms of what they were going into.
There was also a big macho mystique because of that. The constructors were much more open to working with women. And some of the guys were too, but on the crews, especially at that time, there was a real group pressure. So some guys would come to us privately and say, you know, I really support you guys, but I can't speak out on the crew because I'll be endangering myself to do it. And you know, anyway, some people were supportive, some were rabidly hostile. And in fact, when she ended up being the last woman in the line apprenticeship, one young man who's kind of sicko spread feces all over the walls of the women's locker room to express his unhappiness with her existence. And I wanted to mention with Heidi's accident, it was very clearly tied to the harassment and the hazing on the job. She was set up on this particular day she was working opposite 2 linemen in a bucket truck. I think they were replacing streetlights or something. But she was climbing every pole, changing the light out and climbing down, and they were just moving the bucket truck up one pole, and so she was told she was racing them, and so she started running up and down the poles, and one of the poles she stepped on a knot, and that was it.
Megan?
Yes.
Perhaps it would help to just describe what it was like with spikes in your shoes. And
right, that's how you climb the pole.
And,
You've got spikes on the insides of your, or shanks with spikes on them on the inside of your leg, and you climb up. And at the time, it was a macho deal. You had to climb up and down poles free-handed, which means you're just holding onto the pole, with your arms while you climb up with these spikes. And then you don't belt off till you get to the work area.
No safety belt.
No safety belts until you got it.
You need to buckle in and tie in until you got the position.
Yeah, yeah.
instead of tossing it up and climbing up.
And climbing up.
tossing it.
Right, right.
Yeah, and on that day, Heidi actually was using a safety belt, but was unclipped while she worked around some things that were on the pole. And so
Well, she was coming down.
right, but
So
when they
she wasn't belted in at the time.
right, but when so the press played up the fact she didn't have her belt on, which was kind of ironic.
Which was kind of crazy, yeah.
And a knot in the pole would cause
Well, yes,
Spike
spikes
didn't
not
go
to.
in.
It's hard. A knot is where the branch of
Yeah,
the tree
right.
came out,
Email.
and it's really hard. But it's shade, and if you don't see it, or you don't insert your hook, we call it hooks,
Yeah.
your hook in very hard, you will cut out.
Yeah.
So no
So,
matter what height you're at, you will cut out.
yeah.
Can I ask a question about, are you saying that what happened was the 2 men in the bucket truck were basically hazing her and she was having to rush to keep
She
up?
was told she had to keep up with them.
Yeah, I see.
And they were going really fast because they didn't have to climb the poles, and she was climbing each pole. And so she started running up and down the poles.
Wow.
And that's where the accident happened. Her hook went into this knot and held for a second. She stepped out of the other hook, and that's when it kicked out. And then she was not
And she'd
not
been
in the
told-
pole anymore.